All right, good evening, students. Well, that is it's evening right now as I'm giving this presentation. It could be morning where you are now, but anyway, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our presentation, Introduction to Theological Ethics. So, we have three objectives in this presentation. One, we're going to explore what is ethics, and then we will talk about what is theology. And then what we're going to do is we're going to kind of like put our understanding of ethics and theology together to then grasp what is theological ethics. All right, so let's start with the first Roman numeral. What is ethics? Ethics is a branch of inquiry concerned with the question of what constitutes a good life, the question of how we ought to conduct ourselves in difficult situations, and the question of what is right and what is wrong. So ethicists are interested in these three major questions. What is the purpose of human life? What is the proper existence that we as human beings should live? How are we to conduct ourselves when we face difficult moral dilemmas in our lives? And how are we to understand what is right and what is wrong, or what is good and what is evil? So again, three major questions that intrigue and concern ethicists. Now, this is a question that I asked when I was first, studying, ethics and moral philosophy. That is ethics different from morality, right? We kind of use these words interchangeably. Are they the same? Are they different? What's going on? Well, the short answer is no. That is that there is no difference between these two terms. Rather, ethics derives from Greek and morality derives from Latin. So the term ethics comes from the Greek word ethos, meaning custom or moral character. And the term morality comes from the Latin word more, which is of similar meaning to the Greek ethos. And according to Matthews, the author of our textbook, these terms have roughly the same meaning and thus are used interchangeably in our culture. I don't know about you, but I use them interchangeably all the time, and we will use them interchangeably in this course. All right, so we have some understanding of what ethics is. So what is theology? Theology is the discipline dedicated to the study of the divine and the human relationship to the divine as informed by a religious tradition. Now, many of you might be kind of, raising your eyebrow a little bit and saying, theology is the study of the divine. What's the divine? Like, what's going on here? So we are using a more inclusive understanding of theology. That is, if we were using like a Jewish or Christian understanding of theology, then theology would be a discipline dedicated to the study of God. But because we are studying certain traditions like Buddhism that do not adhere to the belief in a supreme being or God, we have to use a more flexible definition. So theology is the study of the divine, and the divine is kind of a general word for that which is ultimate, holy, and sacred, in a religious tradition. And theologians are concerned with the nature of the divine. So, what is the divine like? What is it? But they're also interested in the three major theological questions: cosmology, which is about the origin and structure of the world. Teleology, which is the purpose of the world, and soteriology, which is the purpose of human life. I'm just going to keep that. All right, so the motorcyclist has passed. So here we go. So generally speaking, there are two approaches or two different types of theology: revealed theology and natural theology. So according to revealed theologians, how do you understand these big theological questions like the nature of the divine and the nature of human life, etc.? So how do you do it? By studying sacred texts. That is, there is this kind of assumption that sacred texts contain revelation or some kind of special knowledge of the divine. So if you want to understand the divine and answer these big theological questions, then you must study the sacred texts of a tradition, a religious tradition. Now, this is different from natural theology because according to natural theologians, if you want to answer big theological questions, then you have to rely upon the natural intellect, reasoning, observation, etc. So if you want to understand God, if you want to understand the nature and purpose of human life, you don't have to turn to a sacred text. You can rely upon observing the natural world, using your reasoning capabilities. It's kind of difficult to explain, but there's kind of this idea that human beings have the ability to somehow reflect or like reason about the divine without relying upon sacred texts. And natural theology is often referred to as the philosophy of religion because of its reliance upon, philosophical methods. And in this class, we are going to look at sources from both revealed theology and natural theology, just as kind of a heads up. Now, speaking of which, if you were to go to a seminary, or let's say like a graduate program in religious studies or theology, what you would find is that you would have to study both revealed theology and natural theology. So they're not completely like juxtaposed to one another or independent of one another. Chances are you would study both, and they're both kind of intertwined in at least our Western theological tradition. And what we're going to find, again, is that in our study of theological ethics, that our study is going to comprise both sources in revealed and natural theology. We're kind of caught in the middle. All right, you've been as patient as saints. So we talked about what ethics is, we talked about what theology is. So let's put them together. What is theological ethics? So theological ethics is a branch of inquiry that attempts to make sense of moral dilemmas through the lens of religious teaching. And there are two different types of theological ethics: normative theological ethics and comparative theological ethics. So normative style theological ethics, one is dedicated to trying to understand what is right and wrong as taught by one's own religious tradition, whereas a comparative theological ethicist participates in a more objective study to understand how other religious traditions understand morality. So in terms of the normative, so let's assume that I am a Christian theological ethicist. If I'm a Christian theological ethicist, then I want to know, for example, what is the Christian position on abortion? So if I'm interested in that kind of a question as a Christian, then I am participating in normative theological ethics. However, if I'm a Christian and I'm interested in the Buddhist understanding of abortion and their position on abortion, then I'm taking part in comparative theological ethics. And in this class, we are going to be participating primarily in the comparative version of this discipline. Now, when a theological ethicist wants to understand the position of a religion on a moral dilemma, they will study a religion's sacred texts, their major figures like theologians, mystics, or spiritual teachers, as well as some of like the social and cultural norms of a particular religious society. So again, in our study, we are going to use the same approach. We're going to take a look at the sacred texts of our sample of traditions, the major figures, and we're going to take a look at how these religious traditions have impacted their societies and vice versa. Now, because theological ethicists rely so heavily upon natural theology, we have to gain some understanding of philosophical approaches to ethics, and that is what we are going to discuss in our next presentation.